Hello and welcome back to the One Take Show podcast. My name is Kaustubh. In this episode, we are in conversation with Mr. Karan Tripathi. Karan, in his own words, is a multidisciplinarian. He is a lawyer, a legal journalist, currently working as an associate editor for Livelaw. In this episode, we talk about his recent PIL before the Delhi High Court, which seeks to include the transgender prisoners in the NCRB Prison Statistics Report. We will also talk about the concept, the rationale behind this PIL. We also will talk about what does it seek to establish and what all things do we need to understand about the inclusion of transgenders in the Prison Statistics Report. If you like this episode, make sure you like, share and subscribe to the channel. If you have any suggestions or feedbacks, write them down in the comment below or reach out to me. I would love it either way. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's jump right in. Hello, Karan. Welcome to the One Take Show. I'm truly honored to have this opportunity. In fact, I've been a fan of your work. I've been reading your articles, and it comes to me as a surprise that you're a fresh law graduate. And although I was not aware of the fact, because the maturity in your articles is really stellar, the kind of ideas that you give out, the conveyance of the message is exemplary. And I think every law student who watches this episode can learn a lot about what all work that you've been doing. And I'm very excited about this episode. Thank you so much for taking time out for this conversation and sitting down with me.
Thank you for this lovely introduction, and thank you for having me on your show. It's always great to talk about the work that one's doing and what one sort of encounters while doing that work. So it's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. It's an honor for me. I think it's an honor for the podcast itself. But before we get into the conversation we have lined up here, and it's a very interesting issue. You moved a PIL before the Delhi High Court, and I think it has a lot of issues that we need to talk about as a society as well, and there are a lot of issues that we as law students need to be aware of. But before we get into that, there's a tradition here on this podcast that I believe that law students can really learn a lot from the experiences of the guests that I host. So perhaps if you could tell me a little bit about your experience with law, and what has inspired you to do what you do today, and then maybe we can get into the questions.
I mean, my experience as law has always transcended the literal interpretation of law, and fortunately, that from the very beginning of my career post law school, I've been involved with observing, documenting, and engaging with the practice of law. First, with the additional public prosecutor when we were doing a lot of POCSO and NDPS matters, where I got exposed to the politics of law enforcement, the prosecuting and investigating strategies, and or what we call in movies the dark side of law, and the sinister practices, so as to say, of the state and investigating officers. And later on, when I joined Livelaw, my exposure to those proceedings was from a third-party perspective, where as an observer, I engaged with various criminal proceedings and various other proceedings. So it has been a very, I would say, not just a literal engagement with law in terms of how we interpret law literally, but also a very sociological engagement with law, and an ethnographic engagement with the courtroom. Because I think because my job involved me to sort of visit a wide variety of courts, especially trial courts. And when you go to these courts as an observer, as someone who's there to document what is happening, you not only see the legal proceedings, but you also see the ancillary things that are going on. For instance, the infrastructure of the courtroom, the sociology of the courtroom, how power dynamics play out in a courtroom, how concepts such as caste, class, and gender engage with the courtroom, within the courtroom. So all of these, which are what I call the sociology of a courtroom and ethnography of a courtroom, also becomes apparent. So I realized that if one needs to understand law, one needs to definitely go beyond the books and step into the field, because it is only when one steps into the field that one realizes that the complexities that emerge when the letter of the law interacts with identities, diversity of identities, and especially the marginalized identities. And that is a very fascinating part of my engagement with law.
Right. You do. I think I completely agree with you when you call it the fascinating idea with respect to the engagement of, especially the marginal identities, with how the courtrooms proceed. There have been multiple instances where the courtrooms have taken upon themselves to perhaps take action into this area. And this also is perhaps one of the themes why this conversation becomes extremely important, because quite recently you have moved a PIL before the Delhi High Court, where you have requested, and I quote, where you ask that the NCRB has failed to reasonably classify the transgenders as separate third gender in its annual publication of the Prisoner Statistics in India report. Now, my question on the face of it becomes is, why is it important for NCRB to take such action, and what exactly was the concept behind your PIL? What was the reason with which you moved with this idea in the very first place?
I think we first need to understand what Bernard E. Harcourt said, called invisibility of prisons, and
Okay.
in a virtual democracy. So, what is invisibility of prisons in a virtual democracy? Is that we are living in a democracy where the electorate doesn't engage with the political decision making that much. I mean, we have been
Mm-hmm.
extremely individuated and individualized.
Mm-hmm.
In that sort of a virtual democracy, the prisons and the discourse on prisons have been extremely invisibilized for multiple reasons. I mean, the felon disenfranchisements, like the prisoners are not allowed to vote. They do
Mm-hmm.
not, I mean, no politician or no political party want to associate themselves with prison rights, because that would come
Right.
across as them associating with criminals.
Mm-hmm.
So there are multiple, and then the society also thinks of prisons as punishment. I mean, they forget that people are sent to prison as punishment and not for punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And prisons are not meant for punishment. Prisoners are sent to prison as punishment. The deprivation of liberty itself is a punishment.
Right.
So the society very conveniently ignores this fact and accepts and normalizes what we call the pains of imprisonment, or the pains that the inmates go through inside the prison. So there is in India, I mean, all over the world, but also in India, there is a huge invisibility of prisons, both from the political spectrum as well as from the society. And that's why I realized that it is very important that
Mm-hmm.
before we talk about concepts such as penal reforms or criminal justice reforms, we first have to disseminate information on what is happening inside our prisons. So
Right.
before we moved for a discourse on penal reforms, we first have to democratize and decentralize the discussion on prisons, and that can only happen when when the democratic participation, as we say, or the people in the society get to know what is happening inside the prisons.
Right.
And so the idea is to end the invisibility of prison, or work towards solving this invisibility of prisons. Now,
Okay.
coming to so we have to understand that there is largely invisibility of prisons. Now, it
Mm-hmm.
becomes even more problematic when it comes to inmates or prisoners who come from marginalized sections of society, or who sort of identify with identities that we consider as backward or marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
For them, it becomes even more problematic, because my research in prisons have sort of shown me that the hierarchies, the socioeconomic hierarchies that exist outside the society, they get
Mm-hmm.
replicated inside the prisons. They exist outside the prisons. They get replicated inside the prisons as well.
Okay.
So if someone, the hierarchies and discrimination that we see in the society on the basis of gender, on the
Mm-hmm.
basis of caste, and on the basis of economic background,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of gets replicated inside the prisons also, or something that Professor Mahua Bandyopadhyay said, carceral spillover,
Okay.
that something that happens outside the prison gets the same thing gets replicated inside the prisons. And we see that prisoners who come from socioeconomic backward backgrounds are subjected to exploitation, are subjected to degrading treatment much more than the prisoners who are able to negotiate privileges and negotiate power inside
Mm-hmm.
the prisons purely on the basis of their identity and their social status. So we realize that within this paradigm, the burden of discrimination and the burden of exploitation disproportionately falls on prisoners who identify with marginalized identities.
Okay.
So it becomes very important that when we talk about uh, discourse on prisons, and we're not only talking about we're not only talking about the structural discourse, that is whether prisons have toilets, or, and I mean, this is how the discourse has been in India so far, that when we talk about prisons, whether you take all the Justice Krishna Iyer report or
Mm-hmm.
Mullah Committee report, and if you see the work that CHRI is doing, you see that most of this work is centered around the structural audit of prisons.
Mm-hmm.
That whether, okay, fine, you have prisons are complying with the visiting system, or there are toilets, and there are enough rooms and all those things, infrastructure. But what we ignore, and what the research in India has ignored, is the carceral experience of the
Mm-hmm.
prisoners. So we are not sort of highlighting that what prisoners feel about their experience inside the prisons. What do they feel about pains of imprisonment, about prison staff, about the prisoner and staff relations,
Mm-hmm.
about the mental health in prisons, about degrading treatment inside the prisons, and that's why it becomes very important for us to focus on this carceral experience,
Right.
because focusing on the carceral experience of the prisoners will give us information as to how can we define ambiguous terms such as human rights violations or degrading treatment. How do we define these terms? How
Mm-hmm.
do we define these terms? We define these terms by interviewing, or analyzing the carceral experience of those who are subjected to degrading treatment, who are subjected to that power dynamics or that sociology that goes on inside the prisons. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why it becomes very important to visibilize and to study the carceral experience of all the prisoners, but more so of those who come from backward, marginalized identities and socioeconomic backward backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started looking at the idea of transgender prisoners, I realized that the biggest problem, or the biggest hurdle to researching on transgender prisoners, was that there is no data available.
Okay.
So National Crime Records Bureau, which publishes the Prison Statistics of India report, is a
Mm-hmm.
seminal document. Is a seminal document for any organization, whether it's the independent researchers, institutional researchers, policymakers, civil society, governments for that matter. It's a seminal document for all of them to conduct research on prisons and prison reforms. Right now, I
Mm-hmm.
realized when I read that report, that that report does not include the third gender. That report has invisibilized the data on transgender prisoners. Now, this is problematic because, of course, of the NALSA judgment, because the NALSA judgment very categorically, while recognizing third gender and transgender's right to identify as third gender,
Mm-hmm.
uh, also held that the state authorities have to ensure that in all of their processes and in all of their documentations, they have to recognize the third gender. So, I mean,
Right.
there is a legal precedent uh,
Mm-hmm.
that the NCRB is clearly violating by not including the data on transgender prisoners and capturing the data in binary. But what is also fascinating, if you look deeper into it, that when they are giving out the data in binary,
Mm-hmm.
then either of the two things are happening. First is they are not collecting the data on transgender prisoners at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are like, fine, we will not include them at all. There's a complete trans erasure.
Okay.
Or they are categorizing the data on trans prisoners in the binary, like they are putting it either in male or female,
Right.
which is also, I mean, which is a clear cut violation of NALSA judgment. So either
Mm-hmm.
of the two things are happening, and in both situations they are violating the NALSA judgment, which I find that that must be addressed. And actually, I was very shocked. I was very shocked to see that the NCRP has been publishing this report since ages, and the NALSA judgment had also come long back. And
Mm-hmm.
since then, no one has moved the court raising this issue, that there is an entire community of prisoners who have been invisibilized in the prison statistics of India report. And I
Right.
think this also backs my argument of which I made earlier on invisibility of prisons in a virtual democracy, that we as a society, we as a government, we do not care about that transgender prisoners were being represented in prison statistics or not. So I think I felt that this must be done. This is a very, very preliminary step towards working for the rights of transgender prisoners, because we cannot talk about exploitation, discrimination, and degrading treatment of transgender prisoners until unless we know that they exist.
Absolutely.
We cannot do shadow boxing. No court or no government will listen to you until unless you show them the numbers.
Absolutely.
So I felt that a preliminary step towards any research on transgender prisoners has to start with their representation in Prison Statistics of India report. We need official numbers. We need official data from the government telling us how many trans prisoners are committing suicides, how many trans prisoners are facing custodial deaths, or under what of, or any information under what offenses they are being imprisoned. That also becomes an interesting study. Are they being imprisoned under, because a lot of study in Karnataka has shown that transgender prisoners were arrested under Arms Act, or offenses such as these, which sort of carry a moral turpitude and associated with the stigma that is related to the stigma that is associated with their identity. So it also, the different categories that Prison Statistics of India report shows, it has to include the data on transgender prisoners. Otherwise, we would never know. We would never be able to move to second step until unless we identify that the trans prisoners exist. And that's why I moved this PIL.
Right, right. Absolutely. I think this is absolutely on point. As someone who has perhaps not researched on this much, but someone who's aware of all these situations that are affecting a very significant amount of people. I think I've had a conversation with Miss Vajayanti Vasanta Mokli, where she, being a transgender person, highlighted how there is an issue of identity erasure, where usually the statutory authorities do resort to identity erasure. I think you've already covered this answer to some extent, and but it is extremely important, I think, for me as well, and for all those listeners, to particularly identify, perhaps in bullet points, why is it so important for NCRB to provide the population of our country with a list of transgender persons who are incarcerated, who perhaps in prisons right now? Does it also serve purposes beyond just identity erasure, or does it have multiple implications, in your opinion?
It does have multiple implications. I just mentioned
Mm-hmm.
that any work that needs to be done on penal reforms or prison reforms, as we talk about, as I told you, whether custodial deaths or for that matter, overcrowding, or the kind of or recidivism, basically, reoffending. Any research that needs to be done that has to sort of understand the trend of
Mm-hmm.
transgender incarceration, it has to have official data. It has to look at the official data. And the official, I mean, if you read the Prison Statistics of India report, you realize it carries a wide variety of categories. It's a very illustrious report.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're interested in any part of transgender incarceration or marginalized incarceration, you will see that the report becomes very handy in at
Okay.
least identifying the numbers. And once you have the numbers, once you have the trend, then you
Mm-hmm.
sort of subject those trends to your qualitative assessment or qualitative research. So suppose if I have numbers saying that the 80% of transgender prisoners who died in prisons died of suicides.
Right.
So I this is a very telling account, and now I will sort of place this number, this data, into my qualitative research when I go and interview transgender prisoners, and I identify that why this happens, and I try to identify by treating their carceral experience and their carceral narratives as data of inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And when I use this as data of inquiry, I realize, okay, fine, now 80% suicides that are happening is because of this, of maybe they're not being kept in different cells, and that's why they're constantly subjected to exploitation, harassment, and all those things.
Right.
So my point is that in any study that needs to be done, in any research that needs to be done on the carceral experience of transgender prisoners, or basically on or any topic of transgender incarceration, you
Mm-hmm.
need to have the official data, and the official data needs to represent. And I tell you why also it becomes problematic, because you have to see how NCRB collects data, right? So
Right.
NCRB has a particular performa
Mm-hmm.
that it circulates to different SCRBs and the state bodies, and the state governments then sort of fill up that performa and give it to you.
Right.
Now the point is that, yeah, so and if you read the NALSA judgment also gives you directions on how to treat transgender prisoners. How do you deal with the concept of lodgement of transgender prisoners? Now the point is that if I don't even know that there are transgender prisons in the first place, there are transgender cells in the first place, because that's what NALSA judgment says, that you need to have, you need to provide them with separate lodgement, right? And even your Delhi prison rules, the Delhi prison rules of 2018 also provide for special treatment and special lodgement of transgender prisoners. Now, when the transgender category or a third gender category is not even there on the performa, the state governments will not bother to tell me whether they have whether they are complying with an answer judgment, whether there is a separate lodgement of transgender prisoners, or so that information is completely erased. So you realize
Absolutely.
that the concept of identity erasure, or what I call the trans erasure,
Mm-hmm.
it is related to, it sort of results in subsequent levels of discrimination, right? It is not just a discrimination on the basis of exclusion from the official data, but that exclusion from the official data then becomes ground for further exploitation and secondary victimization in the basis of, if that suppose any grant is being given to the state government for prison reforms, then that grant will not be spent on transgender prisoners because they don't exist as per the official data. Or for that
Right.
matter, if there is a transgender person that, if there is a transgender prisoner who has been murdered, or who has been murdered, or who is facing torture in the prison purely on the basis of the fact that they're transgender, I mean, it's a form of hate crime. And we all know that transgender persons are subjected to hate crimes. Uh, and if there is a form of hate crime that has happened against a transgender person inside the prison, and due to that hate crime, that person has been subjected to torture, or for that matter, even murder, then the data, or the information that will go out is that a particular prisoner has died, or a particular prisoner has tortured, but we will never be able to identify that whether that was an aggravated form of crime, that whether that was a hate crime and a crime motivated by the stigma towards transgenders. Because I told you that the hierarchies and discrimination that exist outside
Mm-hmm.
the prisons, they impinges in prisons as well, they enter prisons as well, and they replicate inside the prisons. So it is very hard to believe that the discrimination that is, or the stigma that is associated with transgender community outside the prisons will not get replicated inside the prisons. It's very difficult to believe. And when you do not have and when you have trans erasure from the official data, then it sort of becomes a foundation for secondary victimization.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
in terms of both, providing privileges inside the prison, but also in terms of identifying the nature of exploitation that they've been subjected to inside the prisons, because the prison authorities can simply say that no, there was no transgender, that was a female or there was a male, and then the entire idea of trans erasure just or the hate crime or aggravated form of crime just vanishes. So I think that sort of answers your question, that how the very preliminary point of erasure, trans erasure from data becomes
Mm-hmm.
the foundation for secondary victimization.
Absolutely. And I think with respect to the changing times that we're facing, it's as you've pointed out that there are all those evils in the society with respect to how the society has perhaps treated these marginalized communities replicate themselves or perhaps find themselves as well in the prisons. The entire system is also replicated in the prisons, which would mean that there is, to some extent, an exploitation with respect to the civil rights, to the constitutional rights, with respect to the political rights that are to be granted to these transgender persons. And if there is an identity erasure with respect to if them not being even accounted for, these issues become even more problematic. But when this issue comes into the place where we have a pandemic around us and we know that all these, in particularly the transgender community, has been perhaps one of the worst hit communities with respect to the employment opportunities, and now we talk about the legal services, the civil, political, constitutional services that should have been provided to the ones who are incarcerated. How does your opinion on what you're trying to perhaps convey through this BIL play out in this scenario? does it even get worse for the people who are incarcerated at this moment?
Yes, of course. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it is not hidden from anyone that prisons in, I mean, when we talk about punishment and discipline in our country, we realize that the punishment and discipline in this country is marked with a sense of violence. For us, whenever we think of punishment and discipline or control, the first thing that comes into our mind is violence, that we need to resort to violence uh, to sort of discipline. And that comes, and I mean, that's what we sort of say a colonial hangover. How the prisoners were treated. I mean, our prison act itself is the act which was made during the colonial period, and it still continues. And there's a lot of discussion on how we need to sort of completely rehaul our prison act. Um, so we have to understand that prisons in India, unfortunately, are not just places for rehabilitation. I think we sort of come far away from the rehabilitative ideal. We are no longer following the rehabilitative ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, prisons have become spaces which subject prisoners to sheer hopelessness. I mean, my research with prisoners who are so during the period of the lockdown, I got the privilege of doing research on prisoners serving life sentence in Delhi prisons. And why I sort of chose to interview prisoners serving life sentences, because I was inspired by this study done by Professor Ben Crew, who is from the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge,
Okay.
where they studied prisoners subjected to life sentence, because these are the prisoners who spend an extremely long amount of time in prisons. So they exhibit different stages of behavior
Mm-hmm.
during their different stages of incarceration. So it becomes very fascinating to sort of interview them and understand the prison sociology from their perspective, because they have been in prison for very long, but also how they have come into terms with the fact that prison is their home, and how do they sort of negotiate their life and their practices and behaviors inside the prison, knowing that they are going to stay there for a very, very, very long time. So my research with prisoners serving life sentences showed me that prisons, and I'm talking about prisons in Delhi, which is supposed to be good prisons. I mean, they're the prisons in the national capital.
Mm-hmm.
It was horrifying. It was horrifying, to say the least. I mean, prisoners have exhibited hopelessness. They have exhibited, most of the prisoners actually got into drugs and got into the habit of hard drugs, for that matter, when they were incarcerated. Before that, they never even used to drink alcohol. But once they came inside the prisons, they developed a habit of taking hard drugs. Um, so there was an extreme. I'm telling you the major trends that appeared,
Mm-hmm.
and one of those trends was uh, hopelessness towards rehabilitation. They feel that there is no point
Mm-hmm.
to even sort of come up with a good behavior, because that's not going to count. There is a feeling that the entire system is against them. Both the government is against them, the society is against them, and of course the jail administration is against them, and they feel that the jail administration sort of sets them up for failure. you know they want them to fail, they want them to not rehabilitate and become contributory members of the society.
Okay.
So and also there is complete uh, ignorance and apathy towards the emotional needs of the prisoners, the mental health of the prisoners. I mean, if you look at the prison statistics, you see that rising number of suicides been happening inside the prisons, and especially the women prisons. And my report that you I did a report on custodial deaths in Delhi prisons in
Mm-hmm.
2020, which used the RTI applications to sort of get the data and look at what is happening in Delhi prisons. And it showed that both the prisoners that had died in the jail number 6, which is women prisons, they both died of suicide, and they both were under trial prisoners.
Okay.
So look at the tragedy of it. I mean, our criminal justice system says that you have to be innocent until proven guilty. But when there are two under trial prisoners who are technically innocent until proven guilty are committed suicide inside the prison, it sort of tells you that what sort of an environment and what sort of treatment they must have been subjected to, or what sort of lack of intervention of mental health that they must have received, that led them to take that step.
Right.
And so you realize that you know Michel Foucault used this term, that uh, how the prisons and the punishment has moved from spectacle of the scaffold to the torture of the soul. That earlier there was a spectacle, punishment was used as a spectacle, and you were publicly punished and all those things. And now the state sort of, instead of physically harming you, it tortures your soul. It breaks you down as an individual. And I think in India, what is happening, and this is what also Professor Maua Bandyopadhyay also said, that in India there is, both of them are happening at the same time. You're also having spectacle of the scaffold, which is sort of reflective in the rising number of custodial deaths and rising number of murders. And I mean, recently a 23-year-old prisoner got murdered in Delhi prison. So you see that the scaffold, spectacle of the scaffold is also taking place. At the same time, there is also torture of the soul. That the identity of the prisoners are being colonized by this extremely alienating system, the system that doesn't care about their rehabilitation, and the system that treats prison as a place for punishment and not as punishment. So there is a lot of, and you know what, I realize that they are able to, the prison administration and the prisons are able to continue with this sort of a system because there is lack of democratic participation in penology, because there is invisibility of prisons. Like, we in our day-to-day lives do not even have a conversation on how the prisoners in our prisons are being kept. And when you sort of talk to these prisoners and you listen to their stories, it opens you up for acceptance and forgiveness. It immediately makes you think that there must have been so many moments in your life where you would have done something that could have landed you in the place where they are. So many moments. There's so many triggering moments in our life where we would have committed something that would have landed us there. And we are so privileged and fortunate that we escaped that. Right. And we sort of got saved by the destiny and self-control. And when you have this feeling, it opens you up for acceptance and forgiveness, which is very, very important. Because these prisoners that you talk about, to realize, and also if you look into the data of prison statistics, you see that most of these prisoners come from they're illiterate, they come from extremely backward societies. And my research with probation officers have also told me that most of them come from families that are dysfunctional, where the parents are into alcohol abuse, drug abuse, where these people are introduced to abuse and violence from the very early stages of their life, or where they live in a neighborhood and they live in a society where there is some sort of inter-family violence going on, or inter-family conflict going on. So there's a lot of background to the fact that they have been imprisoned. And I think what as a society we fail to realize, that when a crime happens, the effect of a crime is not only on the victim, it's on the offender also. Right. Because the crime as an effect, the crime as an event, and crime as an activity not only impacts the victim, but it completely changes the life of the offender as well. Right. So in this moment, I mean, when you sort of look at these data, and you sort of look at these carceral experiences, you realize that we as a society has a role to play in their presence in the prison. Right. The kind of socio-economic inequality that exists in the society, the kind of stigma, discrimination, and alienation that exists in the society, and how that stigma and alienation then gets reflected in our electoral politics, and through electoral politics it gets reflected in the institutions of the state, that how police works. So you see that whichever the government is in power, and their narratives of politics then get replicated in how the police is acting on the street. So police becomes an extended arm of the state's ideology. and we see it now more than ever, right?
Right.
Like you see the kind of things that has been happening on the streets. I mean, it's so funny. I mean, you don't even have to put people in prison anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can, all the things that you have to do in terms of, you know, violence, in terms of confinement, in terms of showing your authority and your power,
Mm-hmm.
you can simply do it on streets by using police as an extended arm of your ideology. So you realize that the way we as a society think in terms of discipline, in terms of control, in terms of crime, in terms of punishment, gets reflected in our politics, and then sort of gets reflected in how individuals who are not that privileged to participate in this discourse on crime and punishment are then are made targets of this extended societal thinking. So I think it becomes very important for us as a society to not only participate in the discourse on crime and punishment,
Mm-hmm.
but also be open to perspectives, also be open to informed discussion and informed discourse
Right.
on crime and punishment. Because what we have to see is that the people who are we sending in the prisons are also citizens of India,
Mm-hmm.
and they are also guaranteed the rights of the constitution that we are guaranteed. I mean, the only right that has been taken away from them is the right to live. I mean, the right to liberty and right to movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the other right, and most importantly, the right under Article 21, and is still guaranteed to them. So we need to think about as a society that we cannot punish people to an extent that we take away their right of being a human being.
Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, so I mean, so yes, I mean, as that's what I was saying, that, you know, all the interviews that I've conducted and the prisoners have said that, you know, they don't even look at us as humans. I mean, they
Mm-hmm.
have said that the prison authorities, they don't even look at them as humans. They treat them like caged animals. So, you know, these narratives have to come out, these stories have to come out, and people need to actively engage with what is happening inside our prisons.
Absolutely. I think this has been one of the most eye-opening conversations that I've had, especially this section of the conversation, because I, being a law student, I constantly believe that I'm rather privileged to perhaps have the kind of an education to understand such socio-political fabric, the kind of conversation that goes around. And yet, despite of me being a law student, having done no research whatsoever in this area, I do find all of these things very, very disturbing, also very surprising because I have no idea about them. Perhaps this is the kind of conversation that would uh, accelerate the issues that we talk about, especially when, if I somehow bring it back to the main issue behind APL with respect to the transgenders, this issue perhaps becomes even more aggravated. You've talked about issues like custodial deaths, you've talked about suicides, and especially when there is an identity erasure, this would even get more problematic. I think you very particularly, while I was reading the article that you just talked about, which I will be linking down in the description for all our viewers, you've talked about that you've categorically mentioned that there is a need to ensure timely and expeditious conduction of inquest proceedings, and in order to somehow solve this problem that has been arising. I would like to request you to please talk about a little bit about what exactly do you mean by this sentence, and where do you see you conceptualizing this idea?
Yeah, so I mean, both in terms of the mandate of the Supreme Court in the suo motu matter of inhumane conditions in prisons, a
Mm-hmm.
very seminal judgment on prison reforms in India, and the NHRC guidelines on inquest of custodial deaths inside the prisons, they both sort of lay down a criteria for both timely and independent inquiry of deaths that take place inside the prisons, and as well as the compensation that needs to be paid to
Mm-hmm.
the families of the families of the deceased. Uh, so we realize that when a death takes place inside the prisons, you have to see that again. I mean, all of it is very much related to the idea of invisibility of prisons, that how
Mm-hmm.
prisons are completely aloof from the public eye. Now, when a death takes place inside the prison, it becomes extremely important for ensuring that the procedures that are laid down are followed to the T.
Okay.
And there's a respect to the procedure that is laid down to ensure that the evaluation and adjudication of the nature of the death is done in an extremely transparent and impartial manner, to not only understand why the death happened, but also to understand where does the responsibility lie. And these are rolling conversations. Now, my research sort of showed me that how in almost uh, I mean, in almost 80 to 90, actually not 80, at least almost 90% of the deaths that had taken place in the past year, in 2020, and in prisons, there was no inquest report within the time frame laid down by the NHRC, and which the Supreme Court had said that must be followed. So it raises, I mean, when we talk about independent inquiry into the deaths in prisons, we see that following a timeline and following procedures becomes extremely important, because because it's a very sensitive issue. and and the first people who have access to that body or access to that event of death inside the prison are the prison administration itself. So so it so if these procedures are not followed completely, it creates a reasonable doubt on the intention of the prison administration and the possible cause of the death. Uh, and so I was talking one of couple of prisoners who actually worked in the administrative department inside the Heart prison. They told me that when the custodial death took place, and they sort of gave me what was the procedure followed, what all they did, and it showed that the first priority of the prison administration was to ensure that none of their members are implicated in this, and there is no sign to show that there was a negligence on the part of the prison administration. So the first thing that they do is to work towards building that narrative. So so it becomes very important, and also it becomes very important to process the compensation, right? I mean, the families of the deceased have a right to know what happened to their loved ones inside the prisons. I mean, this is a when a prisoner is in the custody of the state, so it's the state's responsibility to ensure that the right under Article 21 of the prisoner is guaranteed. So when a prisoner is murdered inside a prison, or has died inside the prison, it is the responsibility and the least responsibility of the state to at least follow the procedures. And when they do not follow the procedures, you see that not only there is a possibility of tampering with the evidence and the nature of the death and identifying the nature of the death, but also of of also sort of ensuring that the family of the prisoner comes to peace with what has happened, and also they get the compensation. So, and I mean, don't even get me started on how meager that compensation is. But so it really shocked me, and I sort of did a follow-up inquiry, and I asked the department as to why this is not there. I mean, you're supposed to have inquest done, report done in 2 months. They said, oh, it's COVID-19, it's pandemic, it's lockdown, and and then later on I realized that the COVID-19 has become a very convenient route for administration to ignore the responsibility. um, I mean, I had moved a petition in Delhi High Court seeking to interview transgender prisoners, and this is a petition preceding the PIL, because I thought that, okay, fine, NCRB doesn't give me any data. Let me just individually approach the prisons and ask them that I want to talk to transgender prisoners. So I wrote a letter, I wrote an email to DG, and DG said, no, we're not going to allow you. COVID-19. So I very clearly mentioned that I don't want to physically come to prisons. I can do it through VC, and the prisons are allowing virtual VC meetings. And I asked, and then I moved a petition in Delhi High Court challenging the decision of the DG of not allowing me to interview transgender prisoners, and the High Court simply said, no, we will not interfere. There is COVID-19. We will not interfere. Now the point is that, so, I mean, the judiciary also has to sort of, not accept these arguments on the face of it, and they need to sort of go deeper and inquire as to how the particular argument of COVID-19 is interfering with the relief claimed. And I think that needs to be done. And that's what also motivated me that, this individual approaching of prisons is not going to help. And you need a structural change. You need a change at a policy level. And that's why I decided it's time to move the PIL. So,
Mhm.
it's not that I didn't try. I tried all possible means available to me before and I think that's what even the High Court appreciated. The
Mhm.
High Court said that representation has been moved. They have written to you. You have done nothing so far.
Right.
So the High Court sort of appreciated the fact that I have not simply come to the court saying that allow this. I
Right.
have done my homework. I have followed all alternative remedies available to me before I reached the High Court.
Right.
So yeah, so and that's why it becomes very important, even in the cases of custodial death, that these are extremely sensitive matters where the procedures laid down are there to ensure that we reach the truth and we ascertain the truth in the most impartial manner. So a
Mhm.
COVID-19 pandemic cannot be a reason for us to flout those procedures,
Right.
because flouting those procedures would completely would completely lead to the idea and the reason for having those procedures, and that is ascertaining the truth behind custodial death, a complete nuggetry.
Right.
So you have to see, I mean, you have to see that what are you using the excuse of COVID-19? I mean, if you're using the excuse of COVID-19 for family meetings and or for lawyer meetings, I can understand, because it's very well within the concept of social distancing.
Mhm.
But why are you following the excuse of COVID-19 for something so important and sensitive, if not done properly, would completely defeat the purpose of it having in the first place?
Right.
And I was so shocked that no one's talking about it. I was so shocked. I mean, I do not have any institutional affiliation with any organization doing research on prisons or
Mhm.
any government body. But what really, really shocks me that no, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the first one who experienced this.
Mhm.
And it again takes me back to the idea of invisibility of prisons.
Absolutely. Right. I think it is absolutely inspiring at every possible level. Everything that you've talked about, everything that you're doing, and perhaps the path that you're paving for every law student who tomorrow, if starts researching on these issues or perhaps starts looking into this issue, would really, really benefit a lot. And with respect to the positive response from the court that you received, I believe was only something that comes out of sheer hard work and the kind of determination, the dedication that goes behind. I mean, being a law student, there's only so much that I can say, appreciate, or perhaps even acknowledge, being owing to the inexperience that I have, or perhaps the kind of exposure that I still need to have. But it is essentially important for every law student, perhaps everyone in the legal community. I won't limit this to the law students, to have this conversation, especially with someone like you who has experted themselves with respect to the research that goes behind it, the understanding of the courts, the understanding of the procedures, the various nitty gritties that go behind, which I was introduced to through this conversation, which I'm truly, truly grateful for. Thank you so much, Karan, for this amazing, amazing conversation. Do you have any closing remarks for our listeners?
I think because law students as a term has been quite a recurrent theme in our conversation, I would like to say that we are at a moment where we see a very disturbing trend from law
Mhm.
students, and that are these contempt requests that are being moved by certain law students. And I know that they don't represent the majority of the law students, and I think law students are much more are much smarter than that. But I think as law students, we also need to, and I think this is also coming from, I was a law student last year. I literally graduated last year.
Mhm.
So I'm a very freshly minted
Right.
law graduate. I think what we need to do is to understand the limitless potential and possibilities that we carry as law students. I mean, what we first need to understand is we have to erase these unfounded hierarchies we have created in our heads, that you need to sort of do this image worship of someone who's popular, and you have to play by the rules set up by your seniors, and you can't possibly go beyond your comfort zone and do something that only professionals are doing. So I think all of these ideas need to be deleted. There are endless possibilities, and people need you. And I'm talking from a space of criminal justice. I hardly see law students in trial courts. I hardly see law students in trial courts, and it's very disheartening. It's very, very disheartening because the trial courts are the foundation are the foundation of the criminal justice system. They are the underbelly of the criminal justice system, and the majority of your criminal justice system is played out in the trial courts. So it is so disheartening to see that law students are not going there. It's so disheartening to see law students not working with the prisons. And what we also need to work towards, and this is what personally I'm working towards, a lot of there are law students in national law universities that have access to this kind of research. I mean, I'm seeing that law students in NLU Delhi have the very, very amazing Project 39A Center where they have access to research on prisons. But we need to sort of create that access for law students in state law universities, in local laws, in law schools which are not as prominent as and do not receive the same amount of patronage as national law universities. So we need to reach out there, and we need to sort of open up the possibilities and horizon for the law students there, because the answers to our legal conundrums are going to come from a decentralized and democratized discourse. And that's why we need to visibilize grassroots. We need to visibilize the complexities of how the criminal justice system interacts with the marginalized identities at a grassroots level. And for that to be visibilized, we need the law students at the grassroots. So, I think the only takeaway that I would like to give to law students is there is no limitation to possibilities. All you need to do is to reach out to the right people, is to have this insatiable hunger for the cause that you want to fight for, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's prisons, police, or whether it's anything, whether it's commercial. But have this insatiable hunger to engage with the personal narratives, with the people who are at the nucleus of of the subject matter of these things. And I think that is what I would like to convey to the law students. That I feel so old because I graduated last year, and this is I wish someone would have told me this when I was in law school. So that's what I'm telling you now.
Perfect. I am cherishing this moment. I am taking everything in. I'm noting your words down. I'm having a mixed sort of feelings with respect to inspiration, a lot of inspiration, and also a pumped up hype where I'm ready to explore all the possibilities and perhaps push all the boundaries.
The millennials have arrived.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, we have. And in fact, it's truly have been an honor for me to have this conversation and to host you on the podcast. I had a wonderful, wonderful time speaking to you, Karan, and I hope you had a good time too.
Yes, I did. Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Perfect.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so much, Karan.